I'm Marcy Winograd, co-hosting tonight with Medea Benjamin. Grace Siegelman is navigating the tech for us. Thank you, Grace. We have a wonderful program planned with Vijay Prashad. He is the director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. That's a movement-driven institution based in Argentina, Brazil, India, and South Africa. So he'll be discussing from Ukraine to Palestine. That's a lot, right? Or Palestine to Ukraine. But he will touch on lots of things that we've been talking about at CODEPINK, including this new bilateral agreement that Biden signed with Zelensky. He'll talk about the U.S. as the global hegemon. What's happening? Are we seeing an emerging multipolar world? Where are we going with Gaza? Where are the pressure points? Where do we need to leverage our power to stop this genocide? But first, I'd just like to share some norms for behavior. Usually everybody very well behaved, but just a reminder, please be respectful at all times, particularly to our host, our featured guest rather, and our hosts. Also, step up, step back, give people room to discuss what they want in the chat, to ask a question. We'll be encouraging you to ask questions later. So with that, let's go to Medea. Medea, you have an update or two for us.
Well, yes, let's see. The Pentagon budget, called the NDAA, passed in the House, and it was enormous, but it wasn't big enough for the Senate, where it's going to be going. And already Senator Wicker said, oh, we need to put more money in there, and upped it by another $25 billion. So that now it is $923 billion. And if you count all the other outside things, we're probably up to $1 trillion. It passed the House with, it was a bipartisan. Many of the Democrats, in fact, most of the Democrats, except 6 of them, voted against it, not because they were against this huge amount of our tax dollars going to the Pentagon, but because of all these amendments that the Republicans stuck on there, things like none of this money can go to address climate change, or none of it can be used to reimburse women who went to get an abortion. None of it could be used for gender transition. None of it could be used for DEI, diversity, equality, and inclusion, that kind of thing. But, it will go into to the Senate, and there it will pass for sure with lots more money attached. So that's not very good news. On the Gaza front, the bill to sanction the International Criminal Court, because it called for money for it called for arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the defense minister. It passed in the House with mostly Republicans, but also Democrats. And that was despite the fact that Biden said that he didn't want to sanction the ICC, although he initially called the ICC call for warrants disgusting. He said that it wasn't a good way to go about it. But we thought, well, it's okay, because we were told that it would never even be brought up in the Senate, because the Democrats control the Senate, and their Schumer would say, no, we're not going to bring it up because Biden doesn't want it to be brought up. But we just read and heard that there are negotiations now going on in the Senate between the head of the Foreign Relations Committee, who's Ben Cardin, and the leader in the minority leader, James Risch. And they are trying to come to a deal with a bill that could pass on the Senate side. So we are very worried about that, and we've been going from office to office asking the senators to vote against sanctioning the ICC if indeed it comes up for a vote. And let's see what else is going on. Well, you might remember that a couple of months back, the Democratic leaders of the Foreign Affairs and the Foreign Relations Committee put a hold on an $18 billion sale of F-15s and missiles and these kits called JDAMs, Joint Direct Munition Kits, that were going to Israel. Well, we have just discovered that they have lifted that hold, which means it will now go to Congress to be notified, the whole Congress, that the administration has signed off on this. We are hearing that there is going to be some dissent, and we're looking forward to that, called a joint resolution of disapproval. If indeed that happens, we will all have to work on trying to get our representatives, our senators to support that. But in the meantime, it looks like that enormous sale of weapons, $18 billion, will be going through. Now, that is separate from the other pause that Biden had put on the 2,000-pound and 500-pound bombs. That was back in May. We are unfortunately waiting every day to be notified that that pause too has been lifted. But so far that hasn't been. And then there is Netanyahu's visit to Congress after Schumer said that Netanyahu was an obstacle for peace and there should be new elections. He agreed with Mike Johnson in the House to invite Netanyahu, and now we know the date is July 24th. Anybody able to come to DC, there are going to be massive protests in Washington, DC, and we are calling on our elected officials to protest that visit, either by going to the visit and then walking out en masse, or not going, or doing something more spectacular, which would be nice. But in any case, we want them to protest Netanyahu's visit on July 24th. So those are my updates, Marcy.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Medea, for keeping us in the loop. So I just want to follow up on a few of the things that you said. You sent me a list earlier of those in Congress who are considering either boycotting Netanyahu's address to Congress or disrupting it somehow. So I'm going to read the list. If your congressperson is not on this list, or even if they are on this list, encourage them to go forth with a boycott or a disruption. If they're not on this list, let them know they should be. Okay, so those who are considering boycotting or disrupting Netanyahu's address to Congress: Don Beyer, Virginia; Cori Bush, Missouri; Jamal Bowman, New York; Greg Casar, Texas; Jim Clyburn, South Carolina; Lloyd Doggett, Texas; Maxwell Frost, Florida; Chuy Garcia, Illinois; Jared Huffman, California; Hank Johnson, Georgia; Pramila Jayapal, Washington; Ro Khanna, California; Stephen Lynch, Massachusetts; Jim McGovern, Massachusetts; AOC, New York; Jan Schakowsky, Illinois; Rashida Tlaib, Michigan; Ed Markey, Massachusetts; Jeff Merkley, Oregon; Bernie Sanders, Vermont; Elizabeth Warren, Massachusetts. So I think all of those, that I read were Democrats, right? Let's see who else we can convince to join that list that's going to boycott or disrupt Netanyahu's speech. You know, Medea, when you were talking about Biden backing off on calling for sanctioning anyone involved with the prosecution or arrest by the International Criminal Court, I thought of an article that I read in the Washington Post. And here's what it said, basically. It said that George Clooney called up the White House, the actor, and said to somebody of importance, I don't want to hear Biden say that he wants to sanction those of the ICC involved in arrests of prosecutors, because my wife worked on those requests for the warrants, right? And this was right before a huge LA fundraiser that was this week. And I think last time Clooney raised something like $500,000 for the presidential race. So lo and behold, Biden backs off on that. So I think we need to ask George Clooney to give Chuck Schumer a call.
That's a great idea, Marcy. And
Why
for
not?
those who don't know, those sanctions are sanctions against the people who worked on that case. So it would be sanctioning his wife. So I think we could call them the Amal Clooney sanctions.
Right. And that would mean that she maybe couldn't come to the United States.
Come to the United States.
Bank account might
Bank
be
accounts in
frozen.
the US would be frozen.
Terrible. All right. Some other things that I read that were interesting this week. Jerusalem Post wrote that Israel has been funding Iran, the Ayatollah, all these years. I think I need to read that one again. I read in a Middle East publication that 1 in 3 people around the world are boycotting one of the products targeted by the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. They don't want to have anything to do with Israel. A lot of those people are in Arab countries, but still 1 in 3, that's a lot, right? Now, some of you may know that Biden, on the sidelines of the G7, signed a 10-year agreement with Zelensky. Of course, this agreement can be broken by Trump if he wins. It says in the agreement that it can be dissolved with 6 months' notice. What does the agreement say? The agreement basically says, okay, we can't guarantee that we're going to give you more weapons. Of course, they just voted Congress and for 61 billion, another 61 billion to continue this war. We can't promise you more weapons, but we can suggest that we will be sending you more weapons because we can leverage some of the money that we have frozen of Russia's assets and use it as a loan to you, okay? And then you can buy whatever you want. That's about $50 billion in weapons. The agreement also suggests that, well, the write-up, the reports on the agreement suggest that Biden and Congress could freeze all of Russia's assets, not just freeze them, but take them, steal them, $250 billion, but they haven't reached that point yet. So that's that. Now, before we go to Vijay, we're very excited to have Vijay Prashad with us tonight. Grace is going to share with you a few things that we've been cooking up at Code Pink that are really exciting. One of which is a website to track all of this money from the American Israel Public Affairs Committee and other Israel lobby groups going into Congress. So Grace, let's see. Bought by Zionism, who are we exposing? Okay, so you click on a link and you can see how much each member of Congress who's taken this money has taken, how much they've given in total. Oh, Joe Biden, $5 million plus, almost 6 million. Menendez, Hoyer, okay. Guilty. Shifty Steny. Jeffries the Joker. Bloodthirsty Brad Schneider. Wicked Wyden, 1,280,000. All right, so there you go. And we have an action which we're publicizing for everyone to write their Congress member and tell them not to take any money from AIPAC. We also have another action that we're launching this week or next week. I think it's this week, yeah, tomorrow or Thursday, to urge everybody to write an email, just one click, send an email to your member of Congress, your senators, to say no more weapons for Ukraine. We need negotiations. This is very frightening. We are on a trajectory to World War III and a nuclear war. A lot of you have been following how now Biden has approved direct attacks inside Russia. Russia is practicing tactical nuclear weapons drills on the border. And Macron is talking about sending in troops. Germany is preparing for war by 2029. So it's really, really serious. And I know a lot of the movement, a lot of the energy is around Gaza, as it should be, because we are witnessing a genocide. We also have to keep in mind what's going on with Ukraine and how frightening this is. And have those difficult conversations. I had one today. They're very difficult. But we'll hear what Vijay has to say about those conversations. So with that, Medea, please introduce our guest.
Well, I'm just delighted to introduce Vijay Prashad. He is a Marxist historian and journalist. He's director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, which is a movement-driven research institution based in Argentina, Brazil, India, and South Africa. He is also chief editor of LeftWord Books, a 20-year-old Marxist publishing house based in New Delhi. He is chief correspondent for Globetrotter, writes a regular column for Frontline and BirGün in Turkey. He has written 25 books, including The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, and The Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South. For 25 years, he was professor at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. He has been a very good friend of Code Pink, especially of our co-founder, Jody Evans. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Vijay.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you. And you know, Medea, I debated before, but I couldn't find any. I was going to paint my hands red in honor of all the brave code pinkers who are there disrupting events. In fact, the word disrupting is misleading. I would say exercising democracy, because in a sense, you're not being disruptive. You're trying to put forward viewpoints that they have suffocated between the sort of one-party state effectively in Washington, D.C., the money media, you know, which includes the New York Times, which includes the Washington Post. And I'm sorry to say, also sometimes media that had a left foot, you know, in the race has now sort of drifted into a kind of NATO mentality. It's very sad to see that. And I'm not, of course, going to name any names because that's not how I would like to start our conversation. But it is sad to see the kind of suffocation of our viewpoint, you know, the way in which so casually members of elected officials of the United States government so casually accuse people who are exercising democracy of being agents of a foreign power. And I was very pleased to see that you responded by saying, well, you are agents of Israel. I mean, we haven't taken any money from Russia. We haven't taken any money from China. But you, as this wonderful website is now going to delineate for the general public, you have taken money from a foreign power. So if you are an unregistered agent of a foreign power, you should face the music. I mean, you know, there's a difference between being an elected official and taking money from a foreign government and being an agent of a foreign power. The gap between the two is closed when these, you know, elected officials take money from AIPAC. It's basically, you know, them that is speaking for somebody else, not their own constituencies. Worse yet, in Europe, where Europeans, particularly in this European parliamentary election, have now started to say, we don't want our policies held hostage by the power games of the G7 lame duck leaders. If any of you watched any of the scenes from the G7 meeting held in Italy, it was comical. You know, the approval ratings of these men, actually 6 men, Giorgio Meloni, I don't know, for whatever reason, the anti-immigrant sentiment in Italy, Giorgio Meloni has still not that bad approval ratings, but Rishi Sunak is going to lose the election in a month. Emmanuel Macron is going to lose his parliament in a month and a bit. Mr. Biden could very well lose the election in November, most likely. If he continues in this path, I don't see how he's going to win the election. Olaf Scholz, his party, in fact, his entire coalition was massacred in the European elections. I'm deeply embarrassed in the face of the German public. And then Justin Trudeau. What can one say about Justin Trudeau? You know, made a mockery of whatever one used to think of Canada, right? So many people in the United States during the Iraq war said, I'm going to Canada. Really? Well, you're welcome to it. It's the home of 60% of the world's mining companies. Some of the most vicious policies conducted via the Canadian government, but all deeply unpopular in their own countries. Why? Because they are pursuing an agenda of war. They are not willing even to pursue an agenda of peace, of development, of taking care of the primary needs of their people. What is a democracy if not a government that takes care of its people? That's a democracy. A democracy isn't an election. You know, you can have as many elections that are corrupted by money power, That's not a democracy. That's toxic. That's a moneyocracy or whatever. A democracy is where a government addresses the primary needs of the people. And for a very long time, the United States and other governments of the G7 have basically abandoned their own populations in the service of the high money elite. Abandoned. Lula, president of Brazil, last week was in Switzerland, where he attended the International Labour Organization meeting. Lula said something very interesting. Lula said that, look, we live on a planet. We live in the middle of a civilization, really. We live in a civilization where there are some people who are able to personally build a rocket ship and fly to another planet. Some people personally able to build a rocket ship, fly to another planet. But these people don't care about this planet. They would prefer to see this planet burn and fly off to Mars. In fact, in response to Lula, when I heard that, I thought, let Elon Musk go to Mars. We don't need him. Let some of the others, Bezos and others, go off with him. We don't really need them. They don't produce wealth. It's workers that produce wealth. We know that. It's not Elon Musk that has produced wealth for the planet Earth. But Lula's statement actually brings us to the core of the issue, is that these are choices. You can either build a massive military and continue wars, or you can deal with the pressing problems of your people. You can't have both. Both are not possible. That's the essence of politics. And I must say that the US government has demonstrated, regardless of what party, they've demonstrated they will choose war over peace any day. You know, I often say that the values of a government, or the values of a country, rather, the values of a country cannot be found in the Constitution. It has to be found in the budget. You know, you can have the greatest constitution in the world, and the US Constitution, by and large, is not a bad document. But what's the point of having a great constitution if more than half of your annual wealth produced towards government spending is going to build the military? What's the point of having a great constitution? What's the point of having laws that say you don't want childhood poverty and so on? What's the point of it? It's just pieces of paper. The real values of a civilization or a culture is how they spend their resources. And the United States comes off really badly. And, you know, we did a study of world military spending. We found that the real military spending by the US government is $1.5 trillion a year. What we also found, which is very interesting, is that 75% of the share of world military spending, 75%, is spent by the United States and its NATO allies. That means the NATO countries plus South Korea and Japan. You add all their military spending up, 75% of world military spending. The Chinese are responsible for 10% of world military spending. The Russians for 3%. Now, if you read the New York Times or you read the Washington Post or any of these pieces of garbage, you'd believe that the real threat to the planet is in Beijing and Moscow. That's the real threat to the planet. If you combine Russian and Chinese military spending, it's about 13% of the share of world military spending. There are almost no overseas military bases that the Russians and Chinese have. The Russians have one overseas military base, a naval base in Tartus in Latakia, Syria. That's it. The Chinese have one overseas base in Djibouti, and this is a base that was there built for the UN mission against piracy. I'm not in favor of that US mission. I think there are better ways to have solved the problem of Somalia than militarizing the fact that fisher people can't survive as their coastlines have been overfished and they've moved to piracy. But that's what that base is for. The Chinese and Russians combined have two military bases. The United States by itself, over 900 military bases around the world. 900 military bases, $1.53 trillion annual spending by the US government on the military. 75% of the share of global military spending is the NATO countries. And yet we are led to believe that the great threats are coming from the Russians and the Chinese. Frankly, Russia would never have entered Ukraine had the United States done something very simple, which is offered to go back and no longer withdraw unilaterally from nuclear treaties and to go back to the table and basically negotiate the anti-ballistic missile treaty, to negotiate the treaties on short-range nuclear missiles, and to negotiate some security deal with the Russians that NATO would not expand further towards its border. NATO is already there in the Latvian countries, but not further, and that Ukraine is not going to be a NATO state. They could have easily negotiated these things because Russia felt threatened. Russia and China are actually not aggressive powers. They are defensive powers. They are trying to defend themselves against the aggression coming from the NATO countries. This is a very hard thing to convince people about. Very difficult to actually convince them that these countries are defensive powers. But listen to this. Where are the Chinese ships off the coast of New York City? Where are they? Where are the Russian ships around the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco? They are not there. They are not conducting freedom of navigation exercises through the Panama Canal. And by the way, China is a signatory of the 1982 Convention on the Laws of the Sea, and China could send a military ship into the Caribbean, into international waters, and China could say, we want our military ship to go through the Panama Canal to exercise freedom of navigation. All flags can fly through. But they don't do that. They are not trying to provoke the United States. But the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, all these countries have their warships at the edge of China, constantly harassing the Chinese coastline, the Iranian coastline, the Russian coastline. I spoke in the Belgian parliament about 4 years ago and begged the Belgian government not to allow the Belgian Navy to join NATO freedom of navigation exercises in the Arctic Circle, to bother Russia from above. I mean, what do we need? Do we need a playground bully effectively poking other kids till they start crying or respond, surrender or fight back? Is that what we want in the world? Today, there was another rumor that Noam Chomsky had died. In fact, Noam is alive and not well. He's 95 years old, but he didn't die today. When Noam and I did the book, The Withdrawal, I asked him one day, what's the best way to characterize the United States government? And he said, well, it's the Godfather. It behaves like a godfather. If you don't submit to us, we're going to whack you. We're going to take you and toss you into the ocean, put concrete blocks on your feet and whatnot. It's the godfather. That's what he said. Very interesting way to put it. I mean, a bit blunt, but very interesting. So Russia enters Ukraine in 2022. Very quickly thereafter, the Ukrainians and Russians start a negotiation to deal with the Donbas region, Donetsk and Lugansk, to deal with the question of a land bridge to the Crimea and so on. These meetings are held in Belarus. The meeting is held in Ankara in Turkey. But then Boris Johnson, the clownish then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, arrived in Kiev. And he went for a walk with Zelensky, who was elected as a peace candidate. Please don't forget that. He took Zelensky on a walk and effectively said publicly that the West is going to back you all the way. You should not negotiate with Russia. We're going to fight till the last Ukrainian is dead on your behalf. That sort of comical attitude was there from Boris Johnson. We're going to back you all the way. And that scuttled the negotiations with the Russians. This conflict could have ended in March of 2022, week 10 days into the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It could have ended in 10 days, but no, they've prolonged it. They've prolonged it so much that US and other officials have gone to Kiev and made extremely inflammatory statements about Russia, taking us to the point now where it's much more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis. Remember, the Cuban Missile Crisis took place when Soviet missiles were being sent to Cuba. This was not in the middle of a shooting war. And once there was a crisis. The Soviets removed the missiles, and they asked the United States to also withdraw missiles that the US and NATO had placed in Turkey, which they did. And the next year, there was a treaty about nuclear missiles between the two countries. Right now, there is a statement from the United States that NATO weapons can be used to attack ICBM warning systems inside Russia. This is a very dangerous provocation. This is happening in the middle of a war. There is no confidence between Russia and the United States. And at this Zelensky invited meeting in Switzerland, Russia was not invited. But I still think something interesting happened at this Zelensky meeting, and we need to focus on it. Peace activists around the world need to focus on it. What was it that happened? What happened was when the paradigm for their final statement was being put together, 6 of the points were basically lifted verbatim from the Chinese peace proposal put out in January of this year. They basically plagiarized the Chinese peace proposal. But because the Russians were not there, India, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil refused to sign on to the statement in Switzerland, indeed embarrassing Mr. Zelensky. And Mr. Zelensky was forced to say, eventually, we are going to have to negotiate. This is a very important statement. And I think the US public needs to hear this, that the Ukrainians have once more said that they want to negotiate with the Russians, and the West must stop blocking negotiations. The West must stop accelerating arms to Ukraine to bring us to a point much more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's so much for Ukraine. And I really think that right now is a good time to push on the Chinese proposal from January and the plagiarized proposal that has come out from the Zelensky European US crowd from Switzerland. We really need to push on that now. They have said themselves, the Ukrainians, we want to negotiate. In The Economist magazine, a deputy intelligence chief of the Ukrainians has basically said, we have to negotiate. It's very important to push on this, because I very much doubt that the money media in the West is going to reflect on this or amplify it. When it comes to the question of the genocide in Gaza, this is an abysmal situation. You know, it's abysmal. It's shameful what the Western countries are doing. It's utterly shameful. And look at this. You know, this is a classic example of the US relationship with Mr. Netanyahu, particularly Democrats. Democrats go out of their way to curry favor with Mr. Netanyahu, and then Mr. Netanyahu always betrays them. Today, he released a video where he effectively scorned Blinken and scorned Biden. You know, this is a video that the Republicans will play on repeat in all the evangelical districts, saying we are the only defenders of Israel. What's the point of having two parties when they are both basically, trying their best to out each other, to, go beyond each other in this ridiculous support of Israel? Support of what Israel? Israeli society is right now gripped in a real crisis. The illegal settlements in the West Bank, the violence against the Palestinians there, the violence in Gaza has really created a toxic atmosphere within Israel. It's hardly an Israeli liberal. What you have now, what passes for criticism in Israel is liberals saying that Netanyahu has prosecuted this war badly. Not that this war itself is an abomination. If you say that, you will be pilloried, you will be tarred and feathered. Very difficult to make a direct criticism of this war within Israel. Israeli society needs healing. It's in deep trouble. And it's not helping at all for good thinking people to feel confused about this. There's no confusion. Israel is an occupying power of Gaza. It does not have the right to defend itself. International law says if you occupy people, you don't have the right to defend yourself against the people you've occupied. But the people you've occupied have the right to resist you. And that's the nature of international law. going to be very hard to push this argument within the confines of US society, because again, the money media has precisely gone in the other direction. I mean, it's so embarrassing to watch these videos, Medea, where code pinkers go up to members of Congress and they say these absurd things like Israel has a right to defend itself. Actually, by international law, no, you don't have a right to defend yourself against the people who've been occupied. There is there are a number of different resolutions in the UN on this very issue. The ICJ and others have complied with this issue. And so it's embarrassing. The low level of intellectual engagement of these elected officials is quite stunning. When they say, they bark at you and say things like they should all be killed and so on, the heartlessness, the lack of humanity. I mean, even if you don't agree with us that there should be a ceasefire, to come out there and bark genocidal statements like that, knowing you are being filmed, demonstrates a real dissent from humanity in this section of the elected officials. It's really embarrassing in the eyes of the world, because what you have done is you have made videos that go viral in the global south. People sort of watch this and go, what's with these elected US officials? I mean, they are firstly ignorant sounding, and secondly, man, they are violent people. They don't understand. They don't seem to have the capacity to feel compassion for people who are being damaged and bombed. I'm going to put this together in a minute and then and we can have some conversation. But here's what I want to say. It's really interesting. There are these two wars going on. There was a conversation in which Mitt Romney was involved. Mitt Romney, famously presidential candidate, put his dog on top of the car. Never forgive him for that. Any dog lover out there is super anti-Romney, whatever his political. How can you put a dog on top of the car? Ridiculous. Anyway, Mitt Romney, in a discussion, said something like TikTok is to blame for the young people in the US protesting for Palestine. I mean, what a weird thing to say. TikTok is to blame. In fact, no. If TikTok is responsible, or other social media apps, why aren't people so upset about what's happening in Ukraine? The reason people are upset about what's happening in Palestine and not so upset about what's happening in Ukraine is that the Israelis are bombing very differently than the Russians are bombing in Ukraine. The Israelis are wiping out neighborhoods. They are bombing institutions, colleges, hospitals, schools, UN installations. They are bombing everything. It's a scorched earth bombing. 2,000-pound bombs drop 10 meters apart. They are just wiping out entire neighborhoods. That's why you see images on social media of, say, a parent crying with the dead body of their child. The Russians have not bombed like that. The Russians are bombing and fighting in a different way. I'm not apologizing for their war. It's a war. We deplore war. But they are not bombing like the Israelis. It's not a genocidal campaign. It's a very different kind of war. They are not bombing in the way that the Israelis are bombing. And I think this is a very important thing for us to register. Because if there were images of white Ukrainians running with dead children down the street, you can be sure that the money media would amplify those images everywhere. They just don't have them because the Russians are simply not bombing in such a savage fashion. And that's the power of the international division of humanity. It is by the global north acceptable to slaughter Palestinians, brown bodies slaughtered. But when a white child is hurt and so on, that is an abomination. Putin immediately got an international criminal warrant for moving children out of the war zone. Perhaps that is a war crime, but he moved children out of a war zone. For that, there was an ICC warrant. Netanyahu, Gallant, all of them, Benny Gantz, all of them, responsible for the murder of perhaps up to 20,000 Palestinian children. They didn't move them out of the war zone in any way except to kill them, 20,000, and no ICC warrant. In the whole eyes of the world, this hypocrisy will never be forgiven. People will never forgive this hypocrisy, this international division of humanity. It has cast a stain on these institutions. And Blinken can say the phrase rules-based international order as many times as he wants. Nobody believes him. Nobody believes him, and nor do you.
Thank you so much. Vijay Prashad, Director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. We're going to have about 10 to 15 minutes of questions with Vijay now. I'll ask the first question, then we'll go to Medea. Vijay, under the overarching question, where is the hope? Perhaps you can tell us how you envision the world in the next 10 years, given the growth of BRICS and maybe the weakness of the dollar or the coming weakness. You've been a student of all these different elections. You have a global grasp of what's happening. So let us in on this, please.
Well, in a way, I mean, the world is changing deeply. Since the so-called Third Great Depression started in 2008, one of the phrases we use in our institute is that the West now knows how to blow up bridges. It doesn't know how to build them. Indeed, not only doesn't know how to build them, doesn't maintain them. If you go to a country like China or Indonesia or even India, you see new infrastructure being built. I mean, when I fly from, say, I'm in Santiago in Chile, when I fly to New York, there's a good chance that the snorkel in the plane is not working, or that the escalator is offline, whatnot. This is things you don't see in Asia. The center of gravity of the world economy is shifting there, and it hasn't helped the United States and the West to confiscate sovereign assets of countries. When the US government and the Europeans confiscated the sovereign assets of Russia, this sent a chill through countries like Saudi Arabia. They're like, man, we shouldn't hold our assets in treasury bills. We better diversify our sovereign wealth, because they can confiscate it at any time. When the US says, my God, we've got to follow market rules, right? You got to have a rules-based society. Confiscating the sovereign assets of Russia, of Afghanistan, of Iran, of Cuba doesn't help your credibility when you start saying, well, we need a rules-based order. So in that sense, the US government itself is producing other islands around the world with which it is not connected. I'll give you a simple example. The Europeans, how silly of them. When Huawei, it's just a Chinese commercial company. It's a private company. Huawei builds 5G networks, amazing networks. In rural China, you can get superb internet. So when they came to the Europeans and said, why don't you buy our 5G tools? The US government, rather than competing against Chinese companies, rather than saying, look, we have American companies that can compete, they tried to criminalize Huawei because they can't compete with them economically. And that's what the US is doing. Either you bomb countries and say, how dare you try to compete with us, or you criminalize them, say that, well, they'll steal your information and so on. But in all these things, through the confiscations, the criminalizations, the talk of decoupling, other things are happening. The Chinese and Russian and Indian economies are integrating. The center of gravity of the world economy has moved rapidly from the Atlantic world to Asia. It's no longer in London, Frankfurt, and Washington. It's moved to Asia. We have to come to terms with it. And I often say, Marcy, that people in the United States need to convince your neighbors, your friends, and others that the United States is just another country in the world. There's nothing special in the US. It's a great place. It's a beautiful country, but it's just another part of the planet. Take your place as a country on the planet Earth, not as a city on the hill that condescends to the rest of the world.
Well, I think that leads to one of the questions that was in here that is asking about China. It asks about China's domestic policy, the Belt and Road Initiative, and what role is China playing and will it play in a multipolar world?
I mean, it's a good question, Medea, because it's all early days, okay? China is a civilization of 2,500 years, pretty unbroken civilization. The Belt and Road Initiative is only 10 years old. it's very hard to judge something that is so young. And yet, in 10 years, because of the vast Chinese surpluses and their technical abilities, the Belt and Road has made enormous strides. I mean, you travel to parts of, say, Eastern Africa, and you don't see roads being built by engineers from Germany or the United States and so on. You see roads underwritten by the Chinese engineers working with African engineers and so on. I mean, what's an interesting development is that Chinese government has been now making pronouncements saying we no longer want to import raw materials from African countries, Zambian copper or coltan from the DRC. We want to help these countries develop industries, and so that they can process and perhaps even build machines out of the raw materials so that they have some of the value added. Why should the value added be extracted out of Africa? Xi Jinping gave this speech at the last China-Africa summit. So in my mind, it's early days. We don't exactly know what's happening, but we know that it's an interesting direction. They are committed to development and peace. They don't want war. The Chinese do not want a war with the United States. When Nancy Pelosi did that adventure of flying into Taiwan, I held my breath. I was terrified. This is a huge provocation. Something might happen. But the Chinese behaved extremely maturely. They let her come, then she left, and then they closed down the airspace just to say, we have sovereignty over this part of the world. But they didn't affect her plane. When Jawaharlal Nehru went to visit troops in Gaza in the 1950s, Gaza then had an airport. There were Indian troops stationed there, UN peacekeepers. In fact, their graves have just been bombed in one of the bombing runs. A very sad incident, actually. Anyway, Nehru's plane took off from Gaza, and 2 Israeli fighter jets came and tried to squeeze them out. And Nehru later went to the Indian Parliament and spoke about this. He said, we felt that our plane could come down. It was a very perilous situation. Well, the Chinese don't play that game. They let Pelosi leave safe and sound. So they are not willing to take up the provocations. Still, early days, let's not exaggerate also what the Chinese are doing.
But one thing I did want to add is that Code Pink has a campaign, China's Not Our Enemy, and Jody and Megan from the campaign just went to PBS headquarters a couple of days ago to ask them to stop censoring the PBS documentary that shows how China lifted 100 million of their people out of poverty. So you can go to the Code Pink website and find that under China's Not Our Enemy and contact PBS.
Vijay, I want to ask you about Gaza. I have a lot of friends who are long-time activists. They've been doing this kind of organizing and activism for years and years. And they're turning to me and saying, what can we do? We've tried so many different tactics, shutting down freeways and train stations, marching through the streets, thousands and thousands voting uncommitted in swing states, shutting down the Democratic Party in Sacramento and California, encampments throughout the United States. What's it going to take? What do you think to end this genocide?
In a sense, this is a very important and interesting question. And I think people just have to continue doing what they're doing for 2 reasons. One is you are putting pressure on the government. You are building up popular sentiment. Some 65% of the US population is now in favor of a ceasefire. The reason the number is that high is actually both because of the ghastly bombardment by the Israelis, but also the courage of activists, generations of people being radicalized. And that's the second thing, is generations of people are being radicalized in the United States. It's important to maintain the dynamism, more political education, bring people, into the movement. We are not in a sprint. We are in a long distance race. Some of us have been doing this for decades. Many of us have been doing this for decades. We need to teach some of the younger people that these things aren't a sprint, or they will get demoralized. I think that's important from my perspective. We understand the importance of holding ourselves closely and saying, look, we know that you can't change these things in a day. There's a genocide now, but by the way, there was a genocide against the Palestinians, 10 years ago. 2014 bombing may not be the range of genocide, but war crimes. I mean, I covered the war 2014 from Gaza. I was there in 2015. Absolute devastation in the place. I think Jody, Medea, others were in Gaza around the same time, saw that devastation firsthand. This has been going on for a long time. What we are seeing now is a kind of acceleration of what had become a kind of normal practice, punctual bombing against Gaza, 2008, 2009, 2013, 2014, 2018, every few years, massive bombardment. So in that sense, this is just an acceleration of a long-term trend. We need to get people not to feel demoralized. Very important. So we are in a big fight against a very difficult adversary. But it's also important for people to realize that Israel as it was, Israel as a Zionist project is over. It cannot sustain itself. It is unable to win despite the asymmetry. It's unable to defeat the Palestinian resistance. It's very important to remember that. There were supposed to be several phases of this war. First, the Israelis were going to bomb from the sky. They did that. They devastated Gaza City, devastated Khan Yunis, then they came up to Rafah. Then second was to be the ground invasion. They came in with the tanks and so on. They faced a lot of resistance. And then they withdrew and they went to phase 3, which is where they sit outside Gaza, come in for expeditionary raids and leave. They don't want to spend the night in Gaza because they are being hit hard by the Palestinian resistance. That's what's prolonging this war. There is a resistance within Gaza. This has really brought Israel to a crisis. And I think the end of this genocidal campaign is not merely a ceasefire in Gaza, but it's going to be a real reckoning within Israel. What is the future? I mean, do you want to live as an international pariah state, where the whole world basically despises what you've done? And the few allies you have in the West are going to crumble away. They are not going to be able to sustain it. So we have to continue the pressure. People have to continue with a sense of their own morale, the long-term struggle and so on. Continue the pressure, because all that this pressure does is it puts immense pressure on Israeli society, because Israel has to have its reckoning. That's where it has to happen. The Israeli population will have to come to terms with the fact that it can't live forever as an apartheid entity. The game is over. Nobody is going to let you have this apartheid situation permanently, eternally, and so on.
So we have going to have you on again, Vijay, because we have so many questions, including issues like, please tell us what the heck is going on in India. What is your view of the Uyghur situation? Is there still a strong Latin American left? But I want to end on a comment that somebody put in that I find quite lovely. She said, please tell the group that when you read many of Vijay's articles, you not only receive progressive political analysis, but also an art show. I've seen more artwork from Asia in Vijay's pieces than in all my adult years. So could you tell us, what is the role of culture as we move towards the world we'd like to live in?
In fact, the newsletter from Tricontinental, which will come out on Thursday, is actually filled with Chinese art, new paintings from China. I mean, personally, I'm just an enormous junkie for paintings, for, the art that people create. Art has an interesting role to help foster the imagination. It plays a very important role. It's in art that we learn to hope. Hope is really held together for us by the kinds of poetry, the kinds of imaginative things we produce. And for me, one of the great problems of our period was when the Soviet Union collapsed and so on. The sense that a future was possible we were told, died with it. That's when Francis Fukuyama ran analyst and State Department official said that history has ended. We were told, this is it, guys. Maybe you can tinker with it a little bit, but this is what you get. But I don't want to believe that. I want to believe a future is possible. We don't have to live eternally in the present. And if a future is possible, it's in the imagination that we can hold on to the future. We reach out to the next year and the next year after that through art. It's not through reason alone. You have to make a leap to believe in something. And I believe that the imagination is the territory that we leap into in order to springboard into a future. It gives us a sense that what we are doing is meaningful. And it's so important for everybody who's an activist to care for their own sense of morale. That feeling of demoralization, of hopelessness, of being alone. You are not alone. There are hundreds and hundreds of millions of people around the world with you. And Code Pink has become an icon for people around the world. I can't tell you how many times movement leaders from around the world share videos of you disrupting Blinken or that tremendous video of one of your comrades who was sitting behind Blinken and noticed on the TV monitor that, well, she couldn't be seen, but her hands could be seen. And she started doing sign language protest against Blinken. I mean, that video is so captivating. It exemplifies the human spirit. That video is a painting. That video is a painting.
With that, I really want to thank our guest, Vijay Prashad. We can unmute and all of us can thank you, Vijay. What you say resonates so strongly.
Thank you, Vijay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vijay.